Hi, I'm Konrad. Join me on this episode of The Feral Garden, where we look at how we keep our cool. Welcome to this episode of The Feral Garden, where we're looking at how I put up the shade house. But before I go through how I put the shade house up, let's look at the reasons why. Now, for many years I didn't need any shade over our garden, and it grew quite well. Then a couple of years ago we had some 40-degree days, and they knocked the garden around incredibly. What I ended up doing was taking an old bit of ground sheet that I had when we were camping, it's basically a piece of shade cloth, and I put that up on poles over the garden, and that kept things alive during those 40-degree days. So when I was designing this garden, I decided having a shade house was very important. So I had a look around and had a look at a whole lot of designs, and I needed to find something that was going to be big enough to cover the garden, but also to be cost effective. Luckily I came across a website. It was by a foundation called the Eon Foundation in Western Australia, and what they do is they supply information for Indigenous communities on how to support themselves and how to grow their own gardens. They had a section in there where they could have a design how to make a shade house, and it was perfect because it was exactly the size I needed. With my garden beds being 2.4 metres long and a gap in between, I needed something about 6 metres long. I also needed to have a width to get another lot of garden beds in, so I needed to be about 4 metres wide, and luckily that's exactly the size of the design they had. Now, I did make some modifications to that design, and what I'll do is I'll take you around how I put it together and some of the things that I've changed with it. I'll also put a link in the description to that website, and you can download a copy if you're interested as well on how to put together that shade house. Lots of other great stuff on that website as well if you're interested in how you can produce food, particularly in a very arid climate. So let's get started. You can see it's 6 metres long by 4 metres wide. And the first thing I decided to do was to use some existing water pipe instead of the star pickets that you'll find in the instructions. I have 4 posts each side, and I actually concreted them in just to make sure they were nice and secure. I then got some local supplier of poly pipe. I have 4 lengths of the poly pipe cut, left it out on the lawn to get nice and warm, and then you slide it over each of the posts. To stop that horizontal movement, we use roofing battens. These roofing battens are just over 6 metres long, so they're the perfect length. They don't need to be cut and they don't need to be joined. I also put in some wooden spacers, so when they were screwed on, I'll show you one of those wooden spacers. It just meant that I could have the smoother side on the outside. Use spider web there. And you can see one of the wooden spacers there. To stop the poly pipe pulling out, all you need to do is tech screw it in. So you see down the bottom, little tech screw, and that actually holds it and stops it. I only needed one on each of them, and that's plenty. Once I had the piping up, I found that it was still very wobbly. Now, something that is not in the instructions, something that I designed myself, was this middle structure. This middle timber structure I put up just to give it a little bit of extra stability. Down the bottom, I've got some stirrups concreted in, holding up the vertical poles. Just some structural timber. By the way, I'll just show you this little card I got for my birthday. Gardening is the new rock and roll. How true is that? And this little middle structure again, 6 metres long. I forget the height, something close to 3 metres tall. And it just keeps it stable. It still has some movement in it. It's still not rock solid, but it's a lot better than with just the poly pipe. I also have some shade on this side of the garden. This side was just a very bare area, used to have just a fire pit in it. What I decided to do was to use some leftover poly pipe, and make a little shaded structure on this side. This time I used star pickets because I didn't have any of the water pipe left. Star pickets were knocked into the ground. Polypipe doesn't fit over them. You need to get the right size polypipe if you want it to fit over. But this one I've just cable tied. That means that I can undo it if I need to and change the way the structure is built. For shading, I used an old blind. This one used to be over my daughter's bedroom. It lost its little spring, wasn't working, but I don't throw anything out unless I think I can use it. I actually put that up as shade, and that protects it again from the southern side. On this side of the garden shed, I even put up a little bit of sailcloth. This is actually a shade sail. I popped it up just to give a little bit of extra shade as well. So there are lots of different ways of doing shade houses. So what are the advantages of a shade house? Well, number one, it provides protection when the hot days for the plants. As I said, using about 30% still lets enough light in so that the plants can still grow, but it protects them from those really harsh elements. The second thing is it protects them from the environment. Protects them from winds. Around here we get our southerlies coming up this way, our nor'easter comes across that way, and it prevents the plants from getting too much wind. I used to have broad beans particularly, and every year a westerly wind would come and knock all of the broad beans down just about before they're ready to be picked. At least in here I get some protection from that wind. We've also had hailstones come through, or hailstorms, and they actually can take out your whole crop. We lost nearly all our plants in one very big hailstorm, which actually took out our back pergola area as well. So at least this way there will be some protection. So consider putting up a shade house at your place. It doesn't need to be like this. There are lots of other plans around. I'll show you a design my dad had. My dad has been gardening for a long time, and when he saw this shade structure he thought he might be an idea for his garden. But he put up a completely different one. I'll put a picture up there. So there are lots of different possibilities. So if you want to keep your cool this summer, consider a shade house for your garden. Don't forget to leave any comments or questions in the link below, and I'll see you again on the Feral Garden.